Good evening and welcome to a no holds barred interview with our 18th President, General Ulysses S. Grant. My name is Phyllis Evans and I am the Senior Director of Development for the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library Foundation. Also with us this evening is Angela Starren, our Senior Director of Advancement, and she'll be presenting some of your great audience questions just a little later on. Before I introduce tonight's guest, I'd like to thank each of you for joining us this evening as we make the return from our brief summer break. We have been honored over the course of our webinar series to host some amazing historians, authors, and historical interpreters, and tonight you're in for a really great interpretation of Ulysses S. Grant by interpreter Larry Werline. As always, we will entertain questions from the audience later in the program. General Grant, who is known for his brutal honesty, would like to remind you all that no question is off limits. Please type your questions in the Q&A box below, and we will get to as many as possible tonight. And now, without further ado, please help me in welcoming General Ulysses S. Grant. General, thank you for joining us this evening. Now, you said earlier that no questions were off limits, so I plan to be asking some of those hard questions myself. And to get things started, I heard that Ulysses S. Grant really isn't your name. So what is your real name and why did you change it?
It wasn't my idea to change my name. I was born Hiram Ulysses Grant, named for my grandfather. Yet everyone in the family called me Ulysses. So when I was nominated for the West Point Military Academy by Congressman Thomas Hamer, he did so in a hurry because we had a deadline. And in that case, he listed me as Ulysses Simpson Grant. He thought my name was Ulysses and he knew my mother's maiden name was Simpson. So he guessed at it. So when I arrive at West Point, the error is discovered. And I'm told if I wanted to attend the academy, I would have to attend with that name, U.S. Grant. Well, I thought about it and I liked it even better because my initials, as my father had put on my trunk, was HUG. And the seniors are charged with assigning nicknames to the plebes, the freshmen. And I got to thinking, what could happen with HUG? It'd be a great fodder for a nickname like Huggy Bear, perhaps. So when the names of the plebes were posted, General Sherman, who was a senior at the time, his nickname being Cump, saw my name as U.S. Grant, and others wanted to call me United States Grant, but he said, no, we're going to call him Uncle Sam Grant, or just plain Sam for short. And that's been my nickname for my entire life. I still thank General Sherman for not giving me the moniker that could have been General Huggy. Thank you. Next question.
Yeah, well, that was interesting. I'm a little surprised that Ulysses turned into US, but I like it. So is it true that you never even really wanted to be in the Army?
Yes, that was most certainly true. I had no interest in the Army. My father knew I had also no interest in his tannery business. It was a smelly, dirty place. And he was aware that I would prefer a career in mathematics, my favorite subject in school. So he began looking for a college for me. And this is 1839, and there was not a lot of colleges who taught technical degrees such as engineering and mathematics. You want to be a doctor, a lawyer, a teacher, preacher, you got a college. But he then discovered that West Point was an engineering school. Aha. So he told me that Christmas that I would be getting my appointment there. This is the first I heard of it. I said I had no interest in the Army and I would not be attending. He replied, I'll never forget this. He says, it's free, you're going. And I said, I guess I rather would. I would be going. And that's how I ended up going to West Point.
All right.
Next.
Well, I heard that you and General Lee were classmates at West Point. He finished at the top of the class and you at the bottom. So is that true or is that not for real?
Well, that one is truly false. First of all, Lee is 14 years older than me. He was in the class of 29. I was in the class of 43. Now, he did finish second in his class, and he had the reputation as the only cadet ever at West Point never to receive a demerit. I, on the other hand, had accumulated many demerits, which in turn lowered my class standing to around the middle. My uniform was always too sloppy, and I had difficulty keeping in step when marching. You see, I am tone deaf and have difficulty following the marching band music. I like to tell folks I only recognize two tunes. One of them is Yankee Doodle, and the other one isn't. That's it. Thank you.
I'm told you spent part of the American Civil War in Springfield, Illinois. So what exactly were you doing there?
Well, first of all, you need to understand one thing, that soldiers did not enlist in the regular army. They enlisted in their state militias. And once those units were formed, they were then sent on to the National Army. So all the soldiers and officers had to pass through their state capitals, which in our case is Springfield. I was living at that time in Galena, Illinois, working for a clerk in my father's leather goods store. But when the war breaks out, I figured because of my West Point experience, and I was in the Mexican War, I figured I might get a commission from the governor, Governor Yates. So I traveled to Springfield and asked him for a commission. And alas, he had given all the high commissions to his political friends who knew nothing about military discipline or training, turned out. But he did ask me to stay on as a civilian, as an assistant adjutant, to help him mustering in troops, inspecting camps, doing the paperwork. And I agreed to do so temporarily. And then one of the regiments that came into town, the 21st Illinois from the 7th District, their colonel, Colonel Good, was not very good. He knew nothing about discipline or training. And when I came in to inspect the units, the soldiers liked it. And so they sent a letter and a petition on to Governor Yates asking him to fire Colonel Good and put me in charge. And amazingly, they did. So I ended up getting my commission after all because of that. And so I took my regiment from Springfield and headed into Mexico. And from there, I received a promotion to brigadier general about 2 months after that. And then the rest is history.
Yeah. Well, I see you waving that cigar around there in your hand. And someone told me one time that you smoked about 20 of those a day. So did you make the taxpayers pay for that expensive habit?
The taxpayers never had to pay a nickel for any of my cigars. But then again, neither do I. Here's how this happened. Early in 1862, President Lincoln urged all of his armies to move south. They had been getting their rear ends handed to them, and they had all excuses for not going there. They didn't have enough men. They didn't have horses or ammunition or whatever. I, on the other hand, welcomed a chance to go on the offense, and I did. We moved into Tennessee and won the first major battle of the war for the North at Fort Donelson. For that, I received 3 rewards. Number 1, I received a promotion to Major General, a 2-star general. Secondly, I was given a new nickname by the press. U.S. Grant now stood for Unconditional Surrender Grant. A lot better than some of the nicknames I would get later. And number 3, a newspaper reporter had drawn a sketch of a general holding a cigar and leading the troops in the battle with the cigar in the front. I don't think it was me, but that got put in the papers that it was. So grateful citizens from the North began sending me boxes of cigars, sometimes bag loads of them. And one time I even got a whole train car load of cigars. Now I smoke free cigars. Yes, about 20 a day, but mostly I just chew on them.
All right.
All right.
Well, everyone knows, in addition to cigars, that you're also kind of a big drinker. So, are you frequently drunk? And, I think you were. And then if you were, how did you manage to run an army, as a lush, basically?
Well, that's correct. You can't run an army as a drunken lush. It takes all the wits of a sober man to be able to succeed. I'm telling you, the proof is in the pudding, as they say. I'm not a complete teetotaler, having an occasional drink, probably less than the average Union officer. But I think this whole drunk thing started with generals who were a bit jealous over my quick rise in command. And they dug through my files, the War Department, and found out that when I was a junior officer stationed in the West Coast, it was a rather boring assignment out there. And many of us junior officers created a still for our own fun and pleasure, I guess you'd say. I had missed my family, my wife, and I was despondent one day, and I drank a little bit too much and came on duty. And I was confronted by my commanding officer, Colonel Buchanan. And we got into a shouting match with my alcohol doing most of the talking. I told him I was going to resign from the Army and head back to the East. Apparently, it doesn't take much alcohol to get me drunk. Lesson learned, but too late. And that's how it got started.
So, history kind of goes that you were a pretty big failure at pretty much everything except being a general in the Civil War. So, how do you respond to that?
Whoa, that isn't a very nice question. Oh, well, I think I've been successful in some of my endeavors other than being a general. I think I was rather good as a junior officer in the Mexican War, winning 3 brevet promotions. And I think I'm successful with my family. We have 4 children, my wife and I. That's going well. And you may give my presidency mixed reviews, but following that, I served my country as an ambassador at large for 2.5 years, visiting every major country in the world at the time. Although I did have 2 failures that account for this poor reputation. The first was my failure to support my family immediately after the Army resignation. That was in the 1854 to 59 range. It was in St. Louis. I did everything, but everything turned sour. Farming, bad weather, real estate, debt collecting, city engineering didn't work out, and just plain chopping and selling wood. Nothing was working out. There's a lot of bad luck and timing. That's how I ended up moving to Illinois.
Well, some say that your success was kind of built largely on luck. So was there anything else that made you successful outside of being a general? And
if you're talking about military success here, I've often thought about that very question. And upon reflection, I think the attributes that I might possess that help some of my military success, you think about this. Well, first of all, my ability to remain calm in the chaos of battle. That was, as the soldier said, I don't scare with a darn. I think I learned this trait from my mother. Nothing seemed to fluster her. Secondly, perseverance. You just keep trying until you hit on the right solution. That was important at the Vicksburg campaign. I had tried and failed 5 times to capture Vicksburg. Lincoln said that was the key and we needed the key in our pocket. But I didn't give up. Number 6 worked and the Confederacy was split into 2 and we now had control of the Mississippi River. Let's see, third one probably would be win, lose, or draw. I always move forward. I never retrace my steps. As the Army of the Potomac often did, whether they win, they always pull back to withdraw and refit. I always move forward. And what happens there is you get to keep the initiative for yourself, not for your opponent. Another one would be the ability to understand the terrain of a battlefield. You got to know where to place your army. Where do you think the other army is going to be? You got to know distances. I think this skill came from my landscape drawing class at West Point, one of my favorite classes. And one more I'll give you. I like to keep my orders clear and concise. And make sure my sub-commanders are all in sync and know that everything's being coordinated. I did this at night. You see, whenever the rest of the army went to bed, I went to my field desk in my tent, got a stack of paper and pencils, and I'd write out an order. If I liked it, I threw it over to the left side. If I didn't, I crumpled it up and threw it on the right side. Then when I'm done, I picked up all the ones on the left side and I checked them out to make sure they coordinated each of the commander's orders matched. Then I handed them over to my aide and he delivered them to the general's tent. So the next morning when they got up, they had the orders fresh right there and they trusted those orders. And for me, that allowed me a little extra sleep in the morning as well. Being concise with your orders, you don't say things like, take that hill if practicable, or have your corps move up sometime before midday. That kind of thing doesn't work. You have to be more specific and concise. And I think that's what did it. Wait, well, I got one more. I just thought of. You gotta understand where the morale of your men are. Don't rely on your officers to tell you how things are going. Go to the men themselves. Find out if they're itching for a fight. Find out if they're getting fed enough. They'll let you know the truth. They will. And the truth is always necessary to make good decisions. I think that's enough for now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's well known that the North had more men, more equipment than the rebel opponents. So naturally, you would win even if you were mediocre. Is that not true?
Well, we did have a lot of mediocre generals, and they did have more men, and they did have more equipment, but they still seemed to lose anyway. So that doesn't always an advantage. But let me tell you, the rebels had several advantages of their own to consider in this as well. First of all, early in the war, they had an edge in the quality of their leadership. They had men like Jackson and Lee, and Stewart, and Longstreet, and the 2 Johnstons. This was a considerable starting lineup. Later on, we gained experience and caught up to them. Sherman, Sheridan, Thomas, Ord, Hancock, Logan, and Chamberlain. We became their match. Secondly, they were defending their home turf. That's a great motivator. Plus, a defensive army usually loses less men in a battle. Today, you might call this the home field advantage. Thirdly, the size of the Confederacy was enormous. The Union was charged with taking and holding this territory because we had to take and hold them and bring them back into the Union, you see. And this required a 2.5 to 3 to 1 advantage in numbers. Now look at Napoleon in Europe. He won most of his battles, didn't he? but he wasn't able to control the lands he'd conquered. You simply cannot hold supply centers, communication links, roads, bridges in enemy territory with equal numbers. I think we in the North did an exceedingly well job in this regard. And speaking of Europe, the South had a big advantage as they were favored by most of the European nations. They nearly came in on the side of the South because most of the countries are run by what? Monarchies, emperors, and they favored the South, but where their populace was looking to a democratic North to see if they could win a war, and it would encourage them to demand a Republican government in their own countries. Had they joined the fight, we surely would have lost. They did. Yeah. It was a close thing.
Right.
Also, at the outset of the war, their troops were better trained. You see, our country had a fear of a large standing army. So we kept our regular army really low and relied on militias. The militias were local militias in various towns and counties all across the nation. And these were formed basically to defend the frontier from Indian raids. But as the westward expansion came, the militias in the east had little to do. We in the North, we would have a militia muster maybe once a year in our town or county, and we get together and march around and have a parade and a picnic. But the militias in the South kept their edge. They met regularly, they trained, they learned how to use their weapons. And you know why they did that and we didn't? They were afraid of a slave uprising, and they needed to be ready to stop that. That was a powerful deterrent.
Wow.
And last one is similar. The Confederate cavalry, the horse soldiers, had a distinct advantage over Northern counterparts. Most Southern men were experienced horsemen, whereas the Northern man, maybe from the cities, had less experience. And for the first 2 years of the war, they literally could ride circles around us. But by mid-war, the advantage had melted away. And by the war's end, I think we had the superior cavalry. So you can see by these advantages, we eventually overcame them, or at least neutralized them. So if the South were going to win, they needed to do early on in the war, but they didn't. Thank you.
So let's talk a little bit about Lincoln. And at one point, he was confronted by congressmen that wanted to remove you from your post. And he says, find out what brand of whiskey Grant drinks and send him a barrel of it to all of my other generals. So clearly it was kind of a funny thing to them that you drank, and we covered that earlier. But despite all that, why do you think that Lincoln picked you to command the army?
Well, here we are back to that drinking thing again. Lincoln told me that he never said that. He told the congressman, I can't spare that man, he fights. But he did tell me when he read that in the newspaper, he had a hearty laugh and said, I wish I'd said it myself. But he knew I wasn't a drunk because he sent spies to my camp. Now, he didn't call them spies, he called them coordinators. Coordinator is somebody to come out to coordinate supplies or troop movements, something like that. But Lincoln charged each of them to come back to him personally and to tell him whether Grant was running the army and was he that fall down drunk. All the spies came back and said that Grant was quite sober, and indeed he was running the army himself. So that's why he picked me. I was winning.
So did you and Lincoln get along well? And if so, what made you different from his other generals in that regard?
Yes, we did get along very well. We became friends. We both understood slavery from both points of view, you see, because we grew up born in a log cabin just north or just south of the Ohio River, which is the borderline between slave and free states. And I think that gained us an understanding of what slavery was from both points of view. I was different from his other generals in two other main aspects. I understood that this was a partnership, but I knew I was the junior partner of this. The other generals thought they knew more than Lincoln, and they treated him with disdain. Secondly, I never blamed him for any of my mistakes. The other generals blamed Lincoln for any and all of their blunders. And for this reason, I think Lincoln took a shine to me and to General Sherman, because we took responsibility for our actions. And he, as he told the press, I finally found a general. Thank you.
So speaking of taking responsibility, there is a fact out there that you were a bit of a butcher and that you wasted the lives of your soldiers in futile head-on attacks. So how would you respond to this charge?
Well, I got that unfortunate moniker after the Battle of Cold Harbor. This was on the Overland Campaign early on in June of '64. I lost 7,000 men in 20 minutes. I ordered an attack on Lee's lines because we found out that the trenches behind him were lightly manned, and we were able to get behind him. And I ordered a charge, and that would have him cut off from Richmond. But the general I put in charge of the attack waited 24 hours. And by the time he launched that attack, Lee had seen his mistake and manned the trenches. It was an unnecessary slaughter. I considered one of my two regrets during the war, the other being my second assault at the trenches at Vicksburg. However, I'd like to mention, when considering these casualties during the war, if you put all mine together against the opponents I was fighting, my casualties were less. And even Robert E. Lee, the casualties sustained by him throughout the war was more than what I sustained. And nobody will call Robert E. Lee a butcher. I dare him to do that. And the problem was Lee could not afford to lose those men because he didn't have the replacements that I was able to readily get. I think that answers that question.
All right. Well, another tough one. You were also known as an anti-Semite. Is it true that you had Jews removed from your military department in the South?
Well, I'm going to commend you for digging up some of these tough questions. Yes. No, but I am not an anti-Semite. That was a mistake on my part. Trouble was, when I was in charge of the Department of Mississippi, there was these legal traders coming in and trading with the South that they shouldn't have been. And one of them turned out to be my very own father. And that angered me. And I wrote out an order banning all Jews from the department. And I didn't mean Jews as a religious Jews, but as a legal trader, somebody who wasn't obeying the laws of the department. Anyway, that got misconstrued. Lincoln countermanded my order, slapped me on the wrist a little, and I explained to him I didn't have any problem with the Jewish religion, but I used the terms as a disreputable traitor. And so I apologized to him and to the Jewish leaders, and they accepted the apology. And years later, when I ran for president, I received the vast majority of the Jewish vote. But my lesson here was never issue an order when angry. Thank you.
Yeah. So I also heard that when General Lee finally surrendered to you, you had him outnumbered 10-1, and then you disrespected him by wearing a mud-spattered private's uniform. Did this happen, and why would you do that?
Well, first, in regard to the muddy uniform, that was true. It wasn't a private uniform, it was an officer's satco. But we have been moving so quickly down these muddy April roads, trying to keep up with Lee and get in front of him. We had outrun our own supply wagons, including my personal trunk, with my clean dress uniform. I was forced to come to the meeting in my field uniform, which had mud spattered all over it. I apologized to General Lee, and he understood. So when we sat down to talk, I mentioned to General Lee, and I had met him one time before, but we were in the Mexican War. We were on the same side that time. And he was a major. He was the chief engineer for Scott's army, and I was a mere second lieutenant in Garland's brigade, and I was sent to headquarters with a message. Now, I arrived at mess with my dusty, wrinkled fatigue uniform, and who should greet me at the front door of headquarters but Major Lee himself. He took a look at my pitiful uniform and chewed me out for coming to headquarters looking so poorly. I never forgot that chewing out. And yeah, so here we were a few years later in the same situation. And I asked him if he remembered that incident, and he said he didn't. But this time he didn't chew me out. Now, we'll get to the numbers here. I must say that the former Confederates have taken liberty with the facts with this 10-to-1 stuff. We did not outnumber them that greatly. During the siege at Petersburg and Richmond, Lee's numbers had dwindled down to around 65,000 effectives, and mine had grown to about 140,000. So when we finally broke through his lines and he retreated, we went right after him, and we started tearing off pieces of his army in the rear guard. In a week, he was down to 29,000 effectives at Appomattox. The advanced portion of my army that had surrounded him was around 65,000. So just a 2-to-1 ratio. Those are the facts, not 10-to-1.
Yeah. All right. So after the war, you put it out there, hey, I'm not interested in politics, not going to run for office. And then you turned around and you ran for president. So why was that?
You're right. I had no interest in politics. Even General Sherman's brother, Senator John Sherman, he told me, he said, Grant, stay out of Washington. It's a town full of vipers. They will lie to your face. However, when Lincoln is assassinated, his vice president, Andrew Johnson, when he takes over, he doesn't go along with Lincoln's policies. He has a different idea. The former slave was not given a fair chance. These men had fought for their freedom, for their family's freedom, for their race's freedom. They deserve better. And that's what changed my mind to run for president in 1868. And when I was elected, I supported and passed and signed the 14th and 15th Amendment, which granted citizenship and the right to vote to all men, regardless of race or creed. I considered my presidency Lincoln's unfinished second term. Next.
So speaking of the 14th and the 15th Amendment, and then let's talk about anti-slavery. You said you were anti-slavery, but then you yourself were a slaveholder. So how do you reconcile that fact?
Oh, well, that's another one of those questions posed by the lost cause advocates. Let me digress a minute, describe what a lost cause is. That's basically the Southern point of view that was written about 20 years, started about 20 years after the war had ended. The lost cause claimed that slavery had nothing to do with the reason they were fighting. It was states' rights, they said. But however, if you look at their articles of secession, at least 7 of the 8 of the first states to secede, they all mention slavery as the main cause, not states' rights. Beyond the lost cause, what they did is they attempted to deify men like Robert E. Lee. To them, they found a scapegoat for every decision he made by mistake. That was his mistakes. Where they would look at the northern generals, such as myself and General Sherman, and they vilified him. So this version of the war, you'd think would not be accepted by Northerners, but it kind of was, because they portrayed the Southerners as outnumbered band of freedom fighters fighting against a horde of money-grubbing Yankees, much like the American Revolutionary War against England. So they characterized it as the Second American Revolution. You see, if I get started on this topic, I'm going to keep going. So anyway, let's get back to the question. Yes, I was given a slave as a gift from my father-in-law, a slave. And I used him to work in the fields and chop wood, but I worked side by side with him and I paid him. My friend said I paid him too much. I was paying him even more what we should be paying a white man at the time. So after a while of this, I said, I'm just going to give him his freedom, his manumission. And I didn't accept a dime for him. He was let go with, and I didn't sell him. Well, I really could use the money at the time. But our friends in the Lost Cause didn't mention that. Thank you.
Well, I also heard that you were one of the most corrupt presidents, running a scandal-ridden administration. Do you have anything that you want to comment on that?
Well, this comes back to that viper remark I told you about from Senator Sherman. Corruption in that so-called Gilded Age was rampant, making your modern politicians seem almost second-rate. When one of my staff or one of my cabinet members was accused by the press of some wrongdoing, I would call that person into my office and ask him, is that true? And they invariably told me, no, it wasn't. No, it wasn't, Mr. President. You know the press, they're always accusing you of things falsely. And I said, yeah, that's true. Being a loyal friend, I would accept their explanation. But eventually it was proved that they were wrong and they did those acts. And I believe they were honest. I think that was my shortcoming. A bit naive on that. In the Army, a lot of them were in the Army with me, they reported the truth because that's what I needed to make good decisions. Now in Washington, they had turned into those vipers that Sherman warned me about. Yeah. Yes. That's all I got to say about that.
All right. Well, even bad presidents accomplish something. So what did you do that was really of any note?
Well, I don't think I was the best president, but I don't think I should be labeled as a bad president. I did accomplish some things. I mentioned about the 15th Amendment earlier. And then we passed laws to protect the ballot box for these newly freed men. By the way, I tried to get women included in the 15th Amendment for the vote, but I couldn't get that part passed. Susan B. Anthony was so impressed that she attempted to vote for me and was arrested. She wasn't successful in her attempts to get women's suffrage, but I understand today you have honored her and you do have women's suffrage. Anyway, the troops that we'd sent south crushed the Ku Klux Klan, and we were highly successful in protecting the ballot box. At one point, 20% of the office holders in the South were men of color. However, after I left office, troops were removed, and the colored men didn't enjoy their right to vote for, I believe, another 90 years. Something I think you call Jim Crow laws. Another success, this was a permanent success. The US Senate was saber rattling and looking to start a war with Great Britain. We had a pretty big army and pretty big navy after the war, and they figured this is their chance. They were angry at Britain for supporting the Confederacy, particularly with their shipbuilding, and they demanded reparations. I didn't see any sense in going to war again so soon, So I sent a secret delegation to London to negotiate all our differences, including reparations, the boundary with Canada, fishing rights, everything. And when they came back, we presented that treaty to the Senate, and they would, believe me, they were surprised. They didn't know it was coming. And they did vote the treaty into law. And so by doing this, we had changed our greatest adversary for the first 100 years of our war, of our country. We had 2 wars with Britain. We changed them into our strongest and most permanent ally, even into your time. And lastly, I want to mention again that my presidency was in support of Lincoln's policies. During the war, he had a large Republican majority in Congress, and he passed sweeping social legislation, probably the greatest in our history, including the Morrill Act, which created land grant colleges, public universities, the Homestead Act, commerce laws, and the Transcontinental Railroad. In fact, he even decided where the railroad should be placed. However, the war was on, so these things could not be implemented right away. But now the war is over, I was able to implement these programs and support them, and the nation then grew as a result of those into a world power. That was Lincoln's legacy. And you are the children's children that he was thinking about when he proposed these laws. You are Lincoln's legacy in many ways. Thank you.
I just have a couple more questions before we get to the audience. And I hear, rumor has it, you were arrested when you were president. So what was that for, and how did you get out of it?
Actually, that's a humorous question more than serious. You see, I love to ride horses, and I love to ride them fast. One day as president, I was driving in my carriage down Pennsylvania Avenue far too quickly. A police officer had to ride to catch up with me and pull me over, and he wrote me out a ticket for $15. When he asked me my name, he realized he had just pulled over the president of the United States. He was so embarrassed that he offered to tear the ticket up. I told him, nonsense, you were doing your duty correctly. I had a good chuckle watching the expression on his face. It was worth the $15. But I did pay the ticket.
Well, that's good to know, because after your presidency, I can't even talk. After the presidency, you took a 2.5-year world tour, traveling all over at the expense of the government. So how did you get the taxpayers to pay for that long vacation?
Well, it did start out as a vacation. We wanted to visit my only daughter, who had married an Englishman and had moved to Great Britain. And so we went there for the visit, but things quickly got out of control as the English people themselves had hailed me as a hero and kept inviting me to their towns where they wanted to give me the key to the city. And fairly soon, Queen Victoria took note of this, and she invited me to Buckingham Palace for an official visit. Well, now all the heads of state in Europe didn't want to be outdone, so they all had to invite me to their countries to visit them and to visit their heads of states. And so quickly that became involved in the Middle East, to Asia, all the countries. Now the State Department, our State Department, saw this as an opportunity to use me as what they call an at-large ambassador. So they arranged for the Navy to move me from country to country, and then the ambassadors in those countries then set up and arranged meetings for me. So it took about 2.5 years. So who paid for all this? Well, first of all, the country that was hosting me paid for a lot of it. The US Navy, through the State Department, paid for some of it. And then all the other expenses were picked up by the New York World newspaper, to gain the exclusive rights to report on my travels. I didn't consider this a frivolous sightseeing adventure, as the country gained 2 things. One, the nations of the world had a chance to interact with an American and learn more about our country. And two, I wrote up a report recommending that ambassadors be professionally trained and not just given posts as a presidential favor. So later on, the Secretary of State, John Hay, used that as a basis for creating a professional cadre of ambassadors that was implemented and modernized to this very day. That's it.
All right. Well, we do thank you tonight for putting up with some of these hard questions, and I think our members probably have a few more for you. As you're taking off your General Grant hat and putting on your Larry Werline hat, why don't you answer real quick about your autobiography became a bestseller, and rumor has it that Mark Twain actually wrote it. So is there any truth to that? And then maybe tell them quickly, who's actually buried in Grant's tomb?
Well, this is the modern day hat. This is from the Grant Cottage I visited last month. The Grant biography was actually written by Grant himself, although people think Mark Twain wrote it. Mark did not write Grant's biography. He was a good friend of Grant, and he encouraged him to write it. As a matter of fact, he even volunteered to publish it for Grant at a high percentage of royalty, much higher than anyone else. So Grant was dying of cancer at the time, and he needed that encouragement. And he was able to finish the autobiography 3 days before he died. Twain, to his credit, published that biography in December of that year, 1885. Now, that book, the Memoirs of General Grant, became a bestseller, not for the year, but for the entire 19th century. It was the best-selling book of the century, except for the Bible. Twain was writing a fiction book, and he published it in the same month, December 1885. It's called Huckleberry Finn. That fiction book became the bestseller, not of the year, but of the entire 19th century. So in 1 month, Twain has 2 major victories. And both these books, I understand, are still being published today.
Right. So who's buried in Grant's tomb?
Well, that's probably the most frequently asked question I get as a Grand Impressionist. It originated from Groucho Marx. He was a comedian in a program, You Bet Your Life, in the 1950s. And he asked, who's buried in Grant's tomb? It's a joke question. Everybody thinks the answer, well, is Grant. But here's the deal. There is no tomb. Grant is in it would be like a museum. It's called the General Grant Memorial. You go inside, they've got artifacts, statues. They even have a gift shop. And in there, they have 2 above ground vaults with the body of General Grant and his wife. It's above ground. It's called a sarcophagi. So there is no tomb, and nobody's buried there. Thank you very much, Groucho Marx. I get your $50 for that one.
All right. So now I'm going to turn over the program briefly to Angela Starren, and she's going to bring on some questions from all the members. I've seen them pouring in down there. I know we won't be able to get to all of them, especially since we're running a little behind due to our late start. But Angela, go ahead and let us know what some of the members are asking tonight.
Thank you, Phyllis, and thank you so much, Larry. We'll start with a question from Brad, who wants to know how President Grant and his wife Julia felt about Mary Lincoln.
Felt about, again, what was it again?
About Mary Lincoln.
Oh, Mary Lincoln. Oh my, you just hit on that was a hard question. It beats the ones that I got here. Mrs. Grant had been offended by Mrs. Lincoln the week or so before they went to the theater, Mrs. Lincoln had chewed out the president in front of the soldiers, and Mrs. Grant tried to get in between them to stop the fight. And Mrs. Lincoln turned to Mrs. Grant and said, "You just want to be, you want my job. You want to be first lady," and continued to chew out Mr. Lincoln. Well, that hurt Mrs. Grant. And when the Grants were invited to the theater at Ford's Theater, Grant had to come up with an excuse to tell Lincoln that he couldn't make it because they were going to go visit their children, which they were. But all of the cabinet members' wives had all turned down the invitation, and nobody wanted to go with that woman. She was just beside herself at that point. So yeah, that's a sore subject at our house. We felt that Mrs. Lincoln contributed to the death of her husband by not allowing us to be there, because when we're there, we bring along armed guards. Lincoln's bodyguards. Well, Lincoln's guard had been moved to Richmond for some kind of assignment, and he had two replacement bodyguards, one of which decided it would be better to drink across the street rather than guard the door to the booth, and the other one decided he had better seats and moved away. I don't think Grant's cavalrymen, he brought along his bodyguards, would have let anybody come in.
Okay, so Frank also asked, General Grant had a lot of regrets about not being there that day. So did he ever say anything about that?
Grant and Lincoln were friends, and Grant could not understand why the South wanted to kill Lincoln, because he was going to let him up easy. At the time, they thought it was a conspiracy throughout the South to kill Lincoln. We found out later that wasn't the case, but early on, that's what our thought was, that it was a Confederate conspiracy. And so Grant's feelings were more personal, because he felt Lincoln was a friend as well.
Okay, and there were a few other questions about your relationship with Robert Lincoln and how the arrangements were made for him to be your aide-de-camp and to be there on Appomattox that day. Was that an order from Lincoln, or was that something that you wanted?
Well, that's a good question. Apparently, Mr. Lincoln and Mary were in argument whether to let Robert into the Army. She didn't want Robert in harm's way. So he approached me and asked if there's something I could do. And I said, I got just the assignment for him. He can be a captain on my staff. Now, you'd think, well, I'm just doing that to please the president. But it worked out well for me, because the president and the War Department were constantly sending me telegrams, ask me this, ask me that. It just took too much of my time answering all their questions. Here, with Robert Lincoln on my staff, he is trusted by his father. So I gave him the assignment of answering all these questions. And he did a good job with that, and freed me up to do what I must be supposed to be doing.
Okay.
And he was at Appomattox. He wasn't in the room at the signing, but he was there on the grounds for the surrender.
There was another question about how you were feeling that day at Appomattox.
Which day is that?
At the day of the surrender at Appomattox.
I had mixed feelings. These men had been fighting for their cause, even though I considered it one of the worst causes ever that Army fought for. But I saw these men and I respected them. And I saw that they had fought for what they thought was right. And I agreed with Lincoln that we should let them up easy. They were all allowed to go home, back to their families. We even let them take their horses and mules with them to do the spring planting on their on their small farms. The part that I missed, though, is Lincoln had asked me to come to Washington, so I didn't get to see the actual laying down of arms and the flags by the Confederate Army. So I assigned a General Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain to handle that. And Chamberlain had done something that I don't think has ever been done in the history of warfare at a surrender. He lined his division up along a muddy road and had the Confederates march in front of him to stack arms and flags. Now, these Confederates had been passing their flags through the ranks, and each of them had been crying in the flag. It was a very emotional time. And they had their heads bowed and they were shuffling by Chamberlain. And I was told what Chamberlain did was he ordered his division to salute him, to salute the defeated army. This has never been happened before. And the Confederates looked and saw that was happening, and they returned the salute, honor to honor. These men who had been fighting each other for 4 years probably knew each other better than they did their families back home. And after the ceremonies, I'm told small groups of blue and gray soldiers got together and shared what little food they had in their haversacks. That was something I would like to have seen, and I would like to have seen Lincoln there as well.
An amazing story. So do you have any funny stories about your relationship with Abraham Lincoln? We have another question about that. Any fun or funny stories?
Funny stories with Lincoln. I call this one, it was somewhat humorous, but it was also somewhat touching. I invited Lincoln down to my camp at the end of the war at City Point, and we were going to ascertain how to end this war. And while he was there, we were going to have him review the troops. And so I had assigned one of the divisions to be the result of being the reviewed troops. And when you do that, you prepare for it. You clean your uniforms, you polish your weapons, your bayonets are sparkling. The soldiers then know how to maneuver and what to do. They're practiced on it. Lincoln had gone through like 40 of these during the war. Well, that day, it turned out the Confederates chose to attempt a breakout through the lines, and it was very near where that division was stationed. So we needed them in combat. So we put them into battle to push the Confederates back. And they did so successfully. And another division was called up in reserve to go into battle, but they weren't needed. It turned out it was a colored division, colored troops. They weren't ready for a review, they were ready for battle. But their officers came to me and asked can we have Lincoln review these troops instead? And so I gave them permission. Well, it didn't turn out quite like I expected. Lincoln comes riding up to this division of colored soldiers, and they see him coming, and they start cheering, and they throw their caps in the air. This has never been done at a review, ever. And Lincoln rides right up to them, and they reach out, and they touch each other, and Lincoln talks to them as they go by. There was tears rolling down his eyes, and both of his eyes, and the men were crying. And this wasn't a review, this was a communion. The emancipator and the emancipated got a chance to see each other in person. It was one of the most humorous, but it was also one of the most touching events I'd ever seen.
Well, I hate to cut it off. It seems like there's so many unanswered questions still that I look at the list of questions that came in, and I can tell people are really have a lot to say about Grant. And Larry, we do thank you so much for being with us tonight. And I apologize that we did have a late start and that we weren't able to get to all of the questions. And I do thank everyone for staying with us a little past the time that we normally do. As we close out tonight, Larry, earlier you had mentioned a book that you enjoy reading that is about Grant that you might want to recommend.
As a matter of fact, I have about 109 volumes of Grant books in my library. The recent ones in the last, say, 5 years or so have been coming out very positive for Grant. The Ron Chernow book was one of them that came out recently that's got attention. But I think my favorite one is the Ronald White book on U.S. Grant. I'd recommend that one if you just wanted to pick one. But then, of course, I would also recommend reading his memoirs as well. They're still being published.
All right. Do you have, I know you mentioned earlier that you would be glad to give your email address out to the members so that they could reach out to you and maybe get some of these questions that Angela wasn't able to share tonight answered?
Indeed, I would. Would you like to?
Yeah, go ahead and give it. And then Angela, if you can put that in the comment section for them after that, that would be great.
It's lwerline@comcast.net. That's LWERLINE @comcast.net.
Right, great. So that wraps up this evening. I do thank you all again for joining us tonight. We're so glad to be back after our summer break, and we are looking forward to our fall and winter programming. We've got lots of exciting webinars planned. Some of them are on our website. Some of them will be coming up in the next few days. So be sure and check back every once in a while to see what new ones are out there. The next one coming up, if you haven't registered for it, it's the Road to Emancipation Proclamation with our president and CEO, Aaron Mast, in partnership with Looking for Lincoln. So that should be great. That one is next week, September 29th at 7 p.m. Also, as you close out tonight, you're going to see a short survey. Please take a moment and complete the survey, as it helps us to improve our offerings to you and lets us know what you'd like to see going down the road from us in these webinars. As always, we thank you, our members and our supporters in the audience this evening. We are so grateful for each and every one of you. Now, everyone, please take care, stay safe, and good night.